Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today I got a fun and interesting episode for you guys this evening because we're going to be doing a review of the recently released Anbernic CubeXX. This is a cut down version of the Cube. It runs for about $80 and it is such a weird device with its 1:1 square aspect ratio screen, but it definitely has a lot of charm, and that screen really got me interested in reviewing this unit. You guys have been asking for more reviews like this, so I figured we'd give it a go. Before we get too far involved, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, got a Patreon link down below as well. And yes, that was me in the reflection of the screen. But this unit was sent in from 2retro.com, who offered to send one for review to talk about their store. So I will leave a link in the description below. But like all reviews I do on the channel, all of my opinions are 100% mine, and I'm sure you can trust me by now to tell you what I think of this thing without any sort of preconditions. And basically, this is just the weirdest device ever, but in the most charming way. And again, it is down to the fact that it has a square aspect ratio screen. Normally, a CRT television back in the day would be 4:3. Obviously, televisions now are 16:9. There was never really a format that was 1:1 outside of some very old film for cameras back in the day, and we're talking long before any of you were ever alive. So to say 1:1 aspect ratio is an oddity would definitely be an understatement, because it's not something you see in many handhelds whatsoever, and there is a reason for that, but the charm factor is 100% here, because this thing has a very odd aspect ratio, and we're going to talk about how it works in different systems and how it kind of affects your overall gameplay experience in positive ways. Because honestly, unless you don't like them, having some of these overlays is pretty charming, like playing on a Sega branded TV there, which is definitely a Sony Trinitron. But to talk about the actual unit in and of itself, before we get into the gameplay and talk about emulators it can and can't handle, I want to go over the overall layout. You will see both of the analog sticks are on a line, they are not staggered, and that is definitely something I like in a handheld device. And as far as all of the trigger buttons are concerned, they feel nice under the finger. Everything works here. They've got a really nice textured gnarled grip there, so it is going to be nice. You have USB-C in for power, you have a mini HDMI cable port there, so you can put this onto your TV dock, and then you just have your basic power button. It's like something you've seen 100 times before, except like something you've never seen before because of that screen. But I would say generally the layout of the device works 100% for my hands, but I don't have the biggest hands in the world, so definitely something you might want to think about. And on the bottom here, you will see we have a headphone jack. We have two different SD card slots as well. One is going to be for the primary operating system and everything else that's running on the Cube, including the emulators, and the secondary one is going to be where you're going to store all of your games. And that is a nice touch to separate those two out. I like when device manufacturers do that, and honestly the hardest thing about using this device or any other device like it is going to be putting the micro SD cards back in. Not the device's fault, there's always something that is hard unless you have some good fingernails. And I will say one of my primary things when I test any sort of handheld is the D-pad, and I would say this is exceptionally good. Probably like an 8.5 out of 10. I think Anbernic did their best work with the Saturn Arc D and Arc S shape, but this is like 95% of the way there. It just feels great when you're playing fighting games or arcade games, so definitely high marks on the overall D-pad configuration there. And I would say the buttons, while a tiny bit small, also have a really nice feedback to them. Nothing feels mushy, everything has a nice satisfying push. So as far as actually using this device in your hand, I would say absolutely it is good to go. You'll see in the box here you get basically nothing else. You get an instruction manual, and I know full well you're never going to read that whatsoever. You're going to toss it to the side and Google any questions you have, which is pretty much standard issue. Then this little box off to the side, you're going to get a simple charging cable. You probably already have a dozen of them in your house somewhere, so you may never actually take that out. I would say it could be a tiny bit longer, but that's just me, and honestly it really isn't much of a complaint whatsoever. Let's turn this thing on and get to the big feature of it, that 1:1 aspect ratio screen. It is just so unique, it's so strange, it feels like something that shouldn't exist, yet it also seems to work at the same time. And again, if you want to pick one of these up, I'll leave a link in the description below. 2retro threw a nice little microfiber cloth in there, and trust me, trying to keep screens without fingerprints while you're filming them and reviewing them is probably the biggest challenge of this entire process. Always gets me every single time. So you will see here we have game rooms as well as RA apps. One of them is going to be standalone emulators, and the other one is going to be RetroArch. So we're going to talk about what emulators exist on this machine, how far you can bring it up generationally and it'll still run stably, and whether or not you want to use the standalone apps or the RetroArch apps, because I found in some instances stuff like PSP is going to run much better under RetroArch, and you can even get some internal rendering resolution upscale going there. But honestly, you should expect on some of the later systems just to do 1x on that, and if you get anything else you should feel lucky, because again, this is retailing for $80 $100, so I really want to see what you can get on the lower end of the price point in something like this. Anything under $100, it is kind of fun to play around with, and it does make that screen aspect ratio very attractive because there is the RG Cube, the more powerful version of this, which will run a few more emulators. It is more into the mid to high hundreds, like $150, $160, and for that price point, maybe the 1:1 aspect ratio screen isn't something you might be 100% into. But you'll see here another overlay, and you have a simple menu option. We are on the Game Room apps here, which is going to be standalone, and for the most part, I found that using the RetroArch cores is going to give you a much better experience overall. So if you do want to pick something like this up, so many things run so well in RetroArch, and they're really kind of oriented towards these devices. So I would definitely recommend you start on the RetroArch side of things if you want to get the best emulation off of this device. And you'll see here, we do have the simple menu button. We have different screen filters, not a ton of options when you're in the game room. RetroArch really gives you a lot more when it comes to actual configuration of exactly what you want to get out of one of these things. But like any sort of software emulation handheld, there is going to be a little tinkering behind the scenes to get the look you want, but that's as much of the reason why people buy these things, is just to play games. They like to tinker around and play. But at least my first test here, Final Fight on Super Nintendo, everything seems to be working perfectly fine, but I would definitely expect that out of something like a device like this, because it is 2024. There are a ton of SoCs on the market that can handle Super Nintendo. It really isn't a very high test emulator situation at this point in time. But let's check out PSP. It really is a fun system for that. Let's start on Game Room first. You'll see here on the standalone PSP emulator, the FMV cutscenes are working totally fine. What I actually found was that there was a tiny bit of hitching when I got into gameplay, but the interesting thing is I will show you what it looks like in RetroArch after that. We can compare and contrast the side by side, but I would say, even though we have the letterboxing here, this is a nice size for something like PSP, and you can see there was the first hitch. Now again, this is on the standalone emulator. We will move over to something like RetroArch in just a moment, and I do want you to keep that in mind. Standalone versus RetroArch will do different things, even if they're technically using the same software behind the scenes. This is PPSSPP, and you'll see when we get into the first stage here, watch that whip when we whip the skeleton. There is a micro stutter right there, and that's definitely something that shouldn't be in the game. But now let's move over to the RetroArch side of things, the exact same gameplay, and you're going to see now that hitching is completely gone, and I'll even be able to bump the internal rendering resolution up to 2x. For pretty much anything I tested on the PSP side of things, I got good performance out of this. I got a native frame rate at 1x, and for some games I got a native frame rate out of 2x as well. And because the screen is not massive, you're not going to see a huge difference when you bump that internal rendering resolution up. Things may get a little bit smoother, a little bit cleaner, but you're still really not going to see a huge fundamental difference. So don't think you need to dial this thing up to 4x because the screen doesn't have the resolution even to show all of those pixels. But you'll see here in PPSSPP, under the RetroArch section, I do have all of those different options, including 2x. But let's move over here to something like Dreamcast. This is Crazy Taxi, and I really wanted to see how well Dreamcast emulated on the system. Now you will see that this is close to 4:3, but there is a little bit of a trick if you actually want to dock this thing with the HDMI cable to actually get the aspect ratio to be correct, and I will show you that in just a moment. But pretty much every single Dreamcast game that I tested on this unit ran at full speed, and I really had no issues with it whatsoever other than the fact that I drove into the wall there, but that definitely is a me issue and not the emulation issue. Or something like Cosmic Smash here looks so good on the high quality screen in a 1:1 aspect ratio. If you've never played Cosmic Smash before, I can't recommend it enough. It is one of the strangest games Sega's ever made, and they are a company known for making very strange games. But you will see here, anytime you hook this up via HDMI, it is going to force itself to 16:9. So on my television, I can select a 4:3 aspect ratio, and now I no longer have a stretched Dreamcast image. I think this is just because the makers of these devices assume that people are going to want widescreen, so that is what it does default to if you actually hook it up to a television or capture card. So if you see that out of your unit, do be aware. Now moving on to some of the other emulation options on the CubeXX, Nintendo DS seemed to run perfectly fine for me. Of course, it is one of those situations where you're going to have to use the D-pad to play Ridge Racer, so it can be a little bit hard to control, but that is a Namco situation. And on PlayStation 1, everything again just worked exactly as I would expect it to on every game I tested. And right now I'm capturing this, and I am getting the stretch 16:9. That is just because my capture card does not allow custom aspect ratios. It takes the signal that comes in and presents it exactly as it's received. So if you're trying to capture on this, it might be a little bit of a difficulty. You may need to go into Resolve and conform it down to what you think the aspect ratio should be, which is what I'm going to do right now. You're going to see this is in post-processing. I have changed the aspect ratio just by constraining one of the two numbers on the X and Y axis. That is one thing that I wish the system had a little bit of a toggle for, but of course all of these basically get custom firmwares, so you can kind of change around the software on these devices, get a little bit better performance and some more options depending on what you want to do with it. But I will say this has been a really fun experience. That one-to-one screen is just absolutely something that is very charming, and you kind of get enamored with it. And of course it's going to have basically the ability to play any sort of game you want. Just think PSP and Dreamcast is the top level of this thing, and any emulator below it should be perfectly fine. Something like CPS3 here with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure works totally well. And then you'll see here again, I am just conforming the aspect ratio down. So that is the one thing about the device I wish it had an option for right now, is to force 4x3 when you are connected via the HDMI cable. Even Sega Saturn emulation on the few games I tested seemed to be running well, but Sega Saturn emulation, especially on handheld devices, can be hit or miss. I tested about 6 games and everything worked pretty well, but I don't want to say that this thing's going to be perfect for Saturn because it takes a lot of grunt to get Saturn exactly right every single game you want to throw at it. But at least in my initial impressions, things were quite good, and I really do like the screen aspect ratio here on the Saturn. It basically fits to fill, and it does look good. But the RG CubeXX is a very strange handheld, and that's why I really did want to review it. It's the type of hardware that you're not quite sure why it exists, but you're so happy to know that people are out there making some of the weirdest things for you to play around with. And at 80 bucks, it emulates a metric crap ton of platforms, and if it can do full speed Dreamcast on the go, I'm happy with that. But short of that, we're done. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. But hope you enjoyed the review, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.